Hello, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Katie?
Good. I feel like this is kind of a video podcast in some ways that we have been able to join each other for today.
I know I'm on the adult corner of our YouTube page for
I know.
for a minute. I'm not always over here. I usually hang out in the kids' education world, but now I'm having a real grown-up conversation.
We're having a real conversation. And I mean, I think it's important to let the people at home know who don't get to talk to us every day. Much to their detriment, I
Oh
suppose.
man.
Um, I think the way this video emerged and why we wanted to talk about this. So we are Cairo and I and Jeremy Booker, who is our manager of collections, we talk to each other a lot. We're the only three people we work with really on a day-to-day basis. Chris and Christy are dealing with things that make me nervous.
Yep.
And so are bigger fish to fry. So we talk to each other a lot. And Jeremy, when he did his master's degree in public history at Loyola, did his degree in labor history. I'm of course interested in the Greek American experience, and I have family that we'll talk a little bit about today, actually, who when they came to America spent their first years in America in the coal mines of southern Utah and southern Colorado. And of course, we learned through these conversations talking about labor history and my family's experience that Cairo too has a coal mining history in her family, on the other side of the country in the coal fields of West Virginia. So we've been talking a lot about this sort of in-house. The geographic location of the museum, I think, has meant that maybe historically we haven't told these stories as much. And so we thought it would be interesting to spend some time sort of talking about the Greek mining history and what the Greek community of the Intermountain West, which is very much tied to this coal mining history, looked like in the 20th century and what it looks like today.
Yeah, absolutely. It occurred to me that we didn't actually properly introduce ourselves at the beginning of this for any new friends who might be here. Hi, my name is Cairo. I'm the manager of programs and events at the National Hellenic Museum, and this is Katie Kelaidis, who is much smarter than me, and she is our resident scholar here in general. And today she's going to definitely be leading this a little bit more than I am. This is definitely something she knows a lot more about than I do. But I'm also the editing monkey who puts everything together in retrospect. So I'm not totally useless, I promise.
No. Cairo is here. You don't want me just talking at the camera, so.
Well, Katie, I'm glad that we're doing this. Also, as you mentioned, my family background also, shares some commonality, although I think it probably expresses itself a little bit differently. And for those of you who are curious to hear about that, you, surprise, surprise, on the podcast that we host together, Katie and I host together, NHM Dialogues, my dad is going to be joining us for the next episode that comes out, the next new episode that comes out, which will be, if you're watching this when this video releases, it'll be next Friday, like not in 2 days Friday, but the following Friday. If you're really on top of our content and watching it when it comes out. So my dad will be coming to talk to us a little bit more about my particular family history and what the experience of coal mining in the Carolinas is on the East Coast a little bit more. But first, we're gonna have a bit of an overview of the Intermountain West in general and have those two things in conversation with each other. So Katie, just at the beginning here, I guess the best thing to do, we'll start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, an overview, I guess, just of like the history of the Intermountain West mining situation, like just the bare bones basic framework to get us started today is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is important to remember in the Intermountain West, and we're going to talk more about them today, but you really can't understand the history of the American West if you don't understand the history of the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints, who are commonly called the Mormons, right? So if you don't understand the Mormon movement and its position in the Intermountain West, you really can't understand the Intermountain West. And part of that is the earliest mining activity, coal mining activity in the Intermountain West was under the aegis of the Mormon Church, was at the command of Brigham Young in the 1850s. And they really open up the coal mines of southeastern Utah, where at the turn of the 20th century, we're going to have Greek immigrants working. In Colorado, it's a little bit of a different history, but not terribly. Mining is, of course, gold mining, silver mining. The mining of precious metals is an important part of lots of places in the West, Colorado, California, etc. But really, by the end of the Civil War, as America increasingly industrializes, the demand for coal increases, and these mines begin to open. But what we have really by the second half of the 19th century is a number of coal fields in southern Colorado and southern Utah, northern Mexico, New Mexico, that are being worked increasingly by immigrant communities. And really the first people working in the mines are Mexican, who aren't really immigrants. They've been in the region before it's the United States most of the time. But you also have a lot of Chinese immigrants who arrive to work on the railroad and then stay to work in the coal mines. You have growing numbers as the 19th century progresses and the ports of Japan are opened. You have growing numbers of Japanese immigrants. People are often surprised by the number of Japanese people who live in parts of the Intermountain West. And they came in kind of two different patterns. They either came as immigrants to work on the coal mines and the railroads, or they settled there after the internment camps that were in the Mountain West. So you have, really by the 1890s, you have this growing and vibrant coal industry. And the work of the coal mines, as we will discuss in the podcast and all day today, is dirty, it's dangerous. And remember, before, we kind of think now of coal jobs as being these sort of good working class jobs, these well-paying working class jobs. Remember, before the unions, before the labor movement, really before the Second World War, coal mining jobs were poorly paid, dangerous, dirty. They were not jobs people wanted. And so the people who filled the mines were really people who had no other options. And that frequently, as today with jobs like that, meant immigrant communities.
I didn't realize how many different groups ended up doing I hate to say doing their time in the mines, but that was the first phrasing that came to my brain. I'm surprised by how many different groups of people ended up working in the mines in that era. It is, and as you said, one of the things that I do actually know about a decent amount about is how dangerous and how undesirable it was to be someone who had to go down into the mines between illness or accidents, but both are incredibly prevalent. I'm sure we'll talk about this with my dad, but like my great grandfather got black lung, which is I'm sure a very common coal miner story, right? It was just well before the age of regulation and safety measures and things like that.
I think just not to interrupt you, but I also think that diversity, that ethnic diversity, is one of the things that I think probably separates the Western mining experience from what's going on in Appalachia.
And my dad knows a lot more about it, but I think you're probably pretty right about that, at least from my understanding of that. It's a pretty Appalachia is pretty white overall.
Well, I think that one of the things that's going on, I mean, and this is interesting to think about as we talk about these different stories that emerge. Right. In Appalachia, you had this sort of indigenous, as it were, population of poor white people, right? Of Scotch Irish, predominantly in descent. So you had this sort of indigenous Appalachia since the colonial times. It's kind of been this holding ground of Scotch Irish immigrants, and they were poor then, and they were the kind of people who would go down and work in the mines. The Mountain West did not have that sort of indigenous population of despair, essentially,
of generational miners or generational workers who just
needed work.
And
so they sort of had to import that, and And it was happening in the late 19th and early 20th century, where America is teeming with immigrants. And some of the things that I think gets lost when we talk about immigration in America is the vast majority of immigration to America, percentage wise, happened between 1880 and 1923. The vast majority of that happened then. And, at one point, a quarter of the population of the United States was foreign born, and half of the population of the United States was either foreign born or had at least one foreign born parent.
Which is a very, very prevalent big part of the population. Well, speaking of that, I guess let's maybe now is a good time to focus a little more into our little corner as an institution, which is what brought the Greeks in specific to the mines in the Intermountain West. We've talked a little bit about some other groups who already were there or came before the Greeks came. So what changed? What attracted the Greek immigrant community in particular to the Intermountain West?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that sets the Intermountain West, the Greek community of the Intermountain West, maybe apart from other Greek communities around other Greek American communities, is that the Greeks coming to the Intermountain West were not coming from the nation state of Greece. So they were either coming from Crete, predominantly from Crete, or from the northern territories that still remained part of the Ottoman Empire. So Crete was a free state. The status of Crete goes back and forth all through the 19th century.
I mean, it still is a little bit contentious.
Right.
To this day, it's still a
but Crete is a free state. It's not part of Greece. And you also have people coming from the northern territories of what's today Greece, Macedonia, provinces, which are still part of the Ottoman Empire at this point, right? So while you have like large numbers of Peloponnesians, for example, coming to Chicago, they're coming from Greece because Greece is having a financial crisis. Plus ça change. In 1890, Greece goes bankrupt for the first time in 1890. But these people, the people coming to the Mountain West, are not coming from the nation state of Greece. And they're coming kind of as a combination of economic migrant, but also kind of political refugee in many cases, right? Many people who are coming after having fought in the Greco-Turkish War, having fought in the sort of guerrilla warfare against the Turks for the independence of the island. You have people who are sort of different in that way. Now, they're doing what immigrants do all the time, right? They're following the paths of people before them. So someone from your village goes, and then they send for people from home. That's why we see these regional patterns. But, in terms of geography, you have mountain people going to a mountainous region, just like in Tarpon Springs, you have tropical, semi-tropical island people going to a semi-tropical region. So the kind of harsh mountains of Crete, the harsh mountains of northern Greece, those people end up going and working and living in the mountains of the kind of harsh mountains of the Rockies, right? I had just kind of a personal story. I remember being at my family's home in Crete when I was 19. And I kind of stepped outside to have my coffee, and I looked out and I was like, why does this look so familiar? And I realized it looked just like the view out of my family's home in Utah.
What a moment to have, that like moment of recognition in a totally different part of the world. Yeah, that's why.
I was like, that's why they went there, right? Like,
yeah, it felt familiar in some way. Yeah.
And I think they had that sort of, these were mountain people. Another thing we have in common, Cairo, we come from mountain people. That's a special kind of people.
It's definitely a very particular group. Yeah, that's for sure.
People who live in mountains are a specific kind of people.
I don't know how much I can claim that, because I think, well, not I think, my family was a little more removed at that point. I grew up in Westchester, New York, and we do have the Catskills, but it's not quite the same. I think I'm more of a, I grew up on water. I'm more of a, I guess I would fall into that category. But my family, for sure, are mountain people.
No, tough sorts.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what that says about me that I'm not, but that's fine. But we've also been talking about this offline, as we've come to say when we mean not on camera or microphone.
We're gonna do a reality TV show soon, people. Don't worry. We're people.
Oh God, what would that even be, Katie? What would our reality? That's a conversation for another time.
That'd be very boring reality TV show.
I think it would be. You've also mentioned before though that in particular, it's not just that it's mountainous in general, but there's like a kind of Cretan in particular. Have you talked about that to your satisfaction, or is there more there that you want to talk about?
No, I mean, I think I do. I think there is what happens in the Mountain West. Just like the Greek community of Chicago has this kind of Peloponnesian character, right?
Right.
The Greek community in the Inner Mountain West to this day is predominantly Cretan, or not in the same way it once was.
Anecdotally, one of the first things I did learn about Katie is that not only was she Greek, she was specifically a Greek from Crete. That is true.
Yeah.
That is one of the first facts about Katie I learned when I joined the museum. Not in a way that Katie like sat me down and was like, "You must know that." It just incidentally came up in conversation. But that is one of the first things I learned, was that your family was specifically from Crete.
Yeah, and I think there is a Cretimentos, right? Like a Cretan mind. I think there's I think, in terms of self-perception, right? Cretans see themselves as tough, as independent, as sort of rugged sorts.
Gosh, that's familiar.
Yeah, I think they see themselves as maybe as kind of, and they have this reputation in Greece kind of being barbarians, I think, at some level for that, right? But this idea of this kind of tough, individualistic, hardy people is very much part of Cretan self-definition.
It does kind of smack of manifest destiny American rugged individualism a little bit, actually. Like that sounds pretty similar to that. And so it's interesting that then they became frontiers people.
There's this kind of attitude, I think, of like, don't mess with me, right?
Yeah.
And if you do, I may not win,
but you're gonna get. But
you're not gonna like what happened to you, right?
Yeah, I might still end up on the bottom, but you're still gonna end up with your hand getting bit too. Like, this is not
yeah. I mean, I think it's still a point of regional, national pride. That no German soldier landed alive in the mountains of Crete,
which we have touched on at another moment on this channel. But I think that's actually a really interesting thing to bring up here. Oh, and in our Ohi Day podcast, if you want to hear more about World War II and Greece, go listen to that. We talked about that. That's where I heard that before. Yeah.
So I think that, and that's going to come up here, I think, as we talk about the way the Greek experience in the minds evolved, is that you have these people who are, and oftentimes very hardened fighters, right? My great-grandfather went and fought when he was 8 years old in the Balkans, which is insane, in hindsight, when you think about that. Insane. So they weren't I think there was a certain toughness in that community, that a certain self-perception of toughness that was really important to them. To me too, you know what I mean? Like, I drive Cairo crazy with this.
No, you don't. But you do definitely have a bit of and I don't mean attitude in a bad way, but you definitely have an attitude of like, I'm gonna pick myself up and we're stronger than this and we're gonna keep moving. And it doesn't bother me. I respect it a lot.
No, I think that is like, that's a kind of, this time, there's no crying in baseball attitude of the Creek.
God. But I mean, you also said this when we did our StoryCorps interview for our oral histories thing that we did way back when. I say way back when, like that wasn't like 4 months ago. But it feels like a lot longer.
What is time, Cairo? What is time?
Who knows? A construct is the answer. But when we did that, you mentioned the story about how your mom said, we come from tougher stuff than that. Like, and I think that's an interesting part of this conversation. I mean, I guess that attitude kind of, as we are talking about it, leads nicely into the next thing, which is the Colorado Cold War, that kind of attitude of don't mess with me. So that, as I understand it, and of course you know a lot more about it than I do, but as I understand it, that when it first happened was a big deal in terms of a labor movement that actually fought back, so to speak, against the powers that be. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, and the Ludlow Massacre, and I think there's a mine explosion somewhere in that history too. There's a lot going on there, but if you can talk a little bit more about that, I think this is probably a good follow at this moment.
Yeah, so I think that there are two events, and we'll talk about both of them. I think there are two events that lead really to the Greek community in the Mountain West saying this is the last generation we're doing this. So when we talk about that, in our podcast with Cairo's dad, one of the things you can hear us talk about is like, why is there this perpetual mine community in Appalachia? Why did the Greeks kind of spend a generation in the mine and leave? And I think there are two events that happen within a 10-year period of each other that make those first Greek immigrants in the West resolve that they're getting out of the mines. The first is the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Cold Wars. And the second is the explosion of the Castle Gate mine. Okay, so we should probably do a separate video on the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Cold Wars because it's incredibly fascinating. But the kind of Reader's Digest version is in September 1913, a strike begins in the mines of southern Utah against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which is owned by J.D. Rockefeller, who is the richest, most powerful man in America in many ways at that point, right? It's like it's the Amazon employees striking.
Yeah,
essentially.
Yeah, it's the 1913 version of Jeff Bezos. Yeah,
exactly. If Jeff Bezos had like access to the National Guard,
which is a wild thing to think about, but yeah,
like if Jeff Bezos could call governors like, hey, can you send the National Guard in, and they didn't, like that's what we're talking about. It's crazy when you think about it. That strike was led by a Cretan immigrant named Louis Tykes. And Tykes was a Cretan immigrant who, when he was in Denver, when he was not in the mines, spent time in a neighborhood in Denver where Greek town and Little Italy kind of coalesced around each other, right? And he kind of picked up, so Italy has a labor movement at this point in a way that that Greece does not, right? So Tykes kind of learns these ideas of the nascent labor movement and of like socialism and things. He learns these essentially from these Italian immigrants, right? And he sort of joins those ideas with his like experience with his experience growing up in what we would call occupied Crete, right? So he becomes this important figure. He kind of is, because he's Cretan, the other Cretan miners trust him. He's also very charismatic, and he has these Italian friends, he has Mexican friends. I think I've heard, he learns to speak Spanish, like he speaks a little Italian. He's a sort of charismatic figure. And so he's leading the strike. And he is, the winter of 2013, 2014 is especially cold. So even though the company has thrown the miners out of their homes, they're sleeping in tents and it's really bad, the strike.
I was going to interject here a little explanation about the throwing them out of their homes. The thing to know about mining companies and the way they worked is that they actually also owned all of the housing and things like that around the mines. So I just think it's probably important information for this strike, is the fact that they literally lost access to their homes and things like that because they were actually all owned by the mining company themselves. They didn't own any of their own things. So striking for that long is exceptional because it also meant they lost access to literally their houses. Sorry, I just thought it was an important detail. Go forth.
Absolutely. Now, throughout the winter, there are these series of sort of violent skirmishes in which the governor of Colorado, the governor of New Mexico send in National Guard people. And what they are met with National Guardsmen, and what they're met with, they're imagining what's happened in West Virginia, what's happened in the coal fields in Pennsylvania, which is they kind of meet these coal miners and the guardsmen quickly overwhelm them. That's not what happens in Colorado, because there are these kind of hardened Cretan fighters. And
With
the violence
guerrilla warfare experience in particular.
who have mountain guerrilla warfare experience, which is a very specific kind of experience.
It's a very specific kind of warfare.
Exactly, which these farm boys from Eastern Colorado have not had experience with. And so there is these series of violent skirmishes in October, November of 1913, and December of 1913. A mine guard in December 1913, this is important. So there's violence in several places over those few months. But in December of 1913, a mine guard named Robert McMillan is killed at DeLuga, which is a mine owned by Colorado's second biggest coal company, Victor American Fuel Company. And it was one of the first mines to go on strike. They don't find his killer. So you have these, you have this kind of stirring going on. Mother Jones is in Trinidad by January of 1914, like the Mother Jones, not the magazine, like the person.
The human.
Yeah, the human. She's arrested, and she's held for 9 months. On January 27th, the National Guard discovers an unexploded bomb in Walsenburg. There's all this going on. The same day that the bomb's discovered, the United States House Committee on Mines and Mining opens an investigation into the northern and southern Colorado coal strikes. And this report is actually released kind of after everything is over.
It occurs to me that people might not know who Mother Jones is. Mother Jones is a very famous labor organizer from this period. Just as a note, we can talk about her more or less, but just, she was a school teacher who then became like a union organizer, basically, and she's a very famous and important in labor movements in this period. Great.
Absolutely, yes. So you have this sort of increasing tension over the course of then the late winter of 1914, the first part of the year in 1914. Now, one of the places where the miners have set up camp is in Ludlow, which is in southern Colorado, right outside between Trinidad and Pueblo, for those of you familiar with the geography of Colorado. And there's a sort of growing sense that something bad is going to happen. The body of a strike breaker, there's another murder in March of 1914, the body of a strike breaker named Neil Smith, who you can guess by the name is not Greek, is found on the train tracks near the Forbes tent colony. And this idea that like a American had been killed by these striking foreigners is very much in the air. So this sort of ethnic component, certainly after the murder of Neil Smith, is very much in the air. And remember, there's kind of body count, right? These miners are not, and there's this bomb. So this isn't the usual kind of labor violence America is used to. These miners are kind of being proactive in the kind of violence that's going on. Sometimes when we tell this story in the Greek community, we don't talk about that fact, but I think it's an important fact, right?
Yeah, it's part of the history.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to this kind of different character. So then, but you have this camp at Ludlow. There are women and children. The families of these miners are living in this camp at Ludlow, and I think that's important to remember too. So on the morning of April 20th, 1914, which is the day after the Greek Orthodox Easter that year, and after months, remember, there's months of this building tension. There's been this report the day before that a group of women, speaking of Field of Dreams, this group of union-aligned women have been playing baseball at Ludlow, and they exchange insults with these guardsmen, these National Guardsmen. And one of them says, "Go ahead, have your good time today. Tomorrow we will roast you." So the next day, on April 20th, Louis Tychus is summoned by the soldiers, claiming to be a woman who's trying to speak to her husband in the camp, right? Initially, he refuses the invitation, but eventually he comes into the tent of a man named Patrick Harmrock. And Harmrock is an Irish-born military veteran. He's a veteran of the Wounded Knee Massacre. So when we talk about these overlaps there, and he's known as the Rocky Mountain Sharpshooter.
Oh no, I have a bad feeling about that.
And he persuades Tyches to meet him at the train stop. This kind of gets the camp riled up, but Tyches tells his fellow Greeks to calm down. It's going to be okay. He's going to go to the train stop. The thing is that everyone kind of senses the militia's intent to act on that day. They sense this. The miners in the camp sense this, and they disobey Tyches and sort of take up armed positions around the camp. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think this goes back to the kind of being proactive in this as well.
Yeah, they're definitely not reactionary. They are driving the boat in some ways.
What happens next is actually legitimately a matter of intense historical debate. The guardsmen see the striking miners taking up these defensive positions. The guardsmen are there. And the guardsmen, somebody fires first. Mm-hmm. I don't think we actually know who fired first. We do know that by 9:30 a.m., by very early in the morning, that the most intense period of fighting has happened. And the fighting continues on really well past 5 p.m. At this point, a pumpman train from the Colorado and Southern Railroad is about to pass through. And some of those who are fleeing the battle, the National Guard eventually sets fire to the camp. The camp that has these families inside, and these women and children who've been hiding are burned alive, essentially. What happens at that point, Louis Tyches is killed in the battle as well. And it is, Colorado has sort of two great massacre stories that anchor its 19th and 20th century history, the Ludlow Massacre and the Sand Creek Massacre. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes attempts to conflate those two things miss the point that at Sand Creek, the people in the camp that was attacked by the National Guard, they were not actively attempting to use violence as well to advance.
Yeah, can you maybe do like a little very, very brief cliff notes on what the Sand Creek Massacre was, just for the folks at home?
Yeah, so the Sand Creek Massacre happened in November of 1864. So the Sand Creek Massacre was ordered by John Evans, who was the governor of Colorado, and a man named John Shivington. John Evans is a really fascinating character. He would have likely been president of the United States, but for the Sand Creek Massacre, he is the second territorial governor of Colorado. He is a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He's the founder of the University of Denver, and he's the founder of another university, of someone near and dear to us.
Yeah, he's a founding member of my alma mater, Northwestern University. For our Chicago audience, that's something you're all familiar with. It's around. But I actually think...
Is it Evanston?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, John Evans, not only did he found these universities, he's the namesake of Evanston, the town in which Northwestern exists, and he's also the namesake of Evans Mountain in Colorado.
Mount Evans, yeah.
Mount Evans, sorry, excuse me. It's something I think that I just think is interesting to bring up, because I can't speak to the University of Colorado, but Northwestern...
University of Denver.
The University of Denver, excuse me. But I know that, as an alumni, that it is something that Northwestern is wrestling with, and there is not a consensus about how to deal with it, about the fact that there are buildings on campus named after John Evans and things like that. And he is the founder of the university, so how do you kind of reconcile that
those things of the legacy of someone that in hindsight is very complicated and contributed to some really horrific things, I think is a conversation we're seeing play out on a more national scale as well in other ways, with things like arguments about Confederate monuments and stuff like that. But it's also something that individual institutions are wrestling with.
I mean, the University of Denver and the First Methodist Church in Denver are both founded by John Evans.
Yeah.
And they are both, you know, working through what that
means.
I mean, and John Evans, the Sand Creek Massacre is, you know, I think the important thing, the reason we're even bringing it up here is oftentimes in Colorado history in particular, they tend to conflate the two events. And I think that is very wrong. It was essentially the Colorado National Guard under the leadership of John Evans. Mm-hmm. He wants to be president of the United States, and he thinks being a war hero will help him. And so he sends out a cavalry commander, a hero of the Civil War is going on right now. John Shivington, who's one of the heroes of the Civil War as well. And they end up firing on a winter camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people who have left the reservation with the permission of both Abraham Lincoln and John Evans. There's no food on the reservation where they're being held. And so they get special permission. It's wintertime. They get special permission to leave. And they leave. And then Shivington and Evans send out the Colorado National Guard to fire on them and kill them. And it is, among other things, the Sand Creek camp is a winter camp. There are no men of fighting age in the Sand Creek camp. So I think the crucial difference between Ludlow, in terms of like the rules of warfare, there are adult men prepared to fight at Ludlow. Armed adult men prepared to fight at Ludlow. That is not the case at Sand Creek.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to be transparent as we tell Greek American history, that is something we need to remember.
I appreciate you noting that. I also think it's important. Yeah.
Right. So there's this idea, I think in war, certainly in Cretan culture, this idea of a man old enough to hold a gun, right? This is how we end up with my great grandfather's kind of a child soldier, but that there's this idea that a man old enough to hold a gun is different than an old man, than a child, than women, right? And we can talk about the nuances of that, but I think it's important to remember that at Sand Creek, every adult man was out hunting. They were there because they were starving. They attacked a camp of women, children, and old men at Sand Creek. At Ludlow, first, they used measures that the military should not use against civilians, clearly. I want to make that clear. I'm not on the side of the National Guard in this. But I think it's important to remember there were armed men in the camp at Ludlow who were prepared to fight.
It doesn't excuse what happened, but it does help create the story of how tensions escalated to violence in a way that is understandable, in a way that Sand Creek is not.
Exactly. After Ludlow, and after this very public funeral for Louis Tykes at the Greek Orthodox Church in Pueblo, Colorado, the oldest Greek Orthodox church west of the Mississippi, there's what we call the 10-Day War. And it's sort of this decentralized spat of violence throughout southern Colorado and the coal fields. By the time, and I think we should really have someone on to talk about this more because it's a really fascinating history. But that experience, by the time the coal wars are sort of brought under control, there is, the Los Alamos, there's still to say that the fatalities were probably underreported, but at least 30 people died in the coal wars. And you get numbers between 22 and 30. Some people say it was higher. Both miners and National Guardsmen, civilians. In the aftermath of the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Coal Wars, I think you have growing realization among the Greek miners that this might be another kind of slavery, right? Another kind, the loaded word, but like it might be like going under the Turks again. And so that's and we should have somebody on to talk about this who knows more about, like, who is a historian. There are people who are historians of this event, so we should probably have those people on. The next event that I think is less known, right? The Ludlow Massacre is like kind of like a famous thing that happened. The next event that is kind of less known is the explosion of the Castlegate mine. And this one actually touches very close to home for me. So on March 10th, 1924, so 10 years almost to the day of Ludlow, the Castlegate mine in southern Utah exploded. Southeastern Utah exploded. It's actually the second largest mine disaster in Utah history. The Sunnyside mine is the largest one. But the explosion of the Castlegate mine is a calamity. And there's a couple reasons why. Excuse me. One reason is in the winter months, work in the mine slowed down. For that reason, the miners amongst themselves had agreed that men with families should get first priority for shifts. Okay? And the bachelors would sit it out.
Oh,
March
no.
is still, Cairo sees where this is going.
I see where this is going, and I'm not happy about it. All right, go on. Yeah.
March is still very much winter in Colorado and Utah. And so on that day when the mine exploded at Castlegate, the vast majority of miners in the mines had families and were the breadwinners, right?
Yep. Uh-huh.
My grandmother's oldest sister, her husband, Uncle Gus, his father was killed in the mine that day. As were 171 other men. 172, 171. Several of the bodies the mine collapsed and then caught fire. So when eventually the bodies were pulled out, some of them were sort of charred beyond recognition.
Yeah.
They also, when it took them, because of this fire, it took several hours to get into the mine, right? And when the coal company eventually got into the mine, they started pulling the mules out, not the miners. A mule to go down into a coal mine needs to be blinded. A sighted mule won't go into a coal mine.
Yeah, because they see it and they go, no, thank you.
Yeah.
It's understandable.
For obvious, because mules are not dumb.
No, they're not. They're like, not, you know what? That dank cave is not a place that I feel like going. We're good.
Yeah, no, so the mules, are actually mining mules, were incredibly expensive and rare and valuable. And the miners were not. Essentially.
Yep.
And so the wreckage across, it's this horrible explosion. It's a disaster that kills mainly husbands and fathers. It's very clear that the coal company and the rescue crews and everyone around has no interest in actually saving the miners. They get into the mine, they start pulling out the animals, not the men in the mine. And because so many children are left orphaned, because so many widows exist at this, right? This is large numbers of the breadwinners in this community are killed in a single day. And you can imagine a community that's already pretty on the edge, right? The idea that in a single day, half of the breadwinners in the community die. You can imagine what the psychological impact this has. My great grandfather lost his leg in the mine that day. Remember, 172 people are killed, but many more injured, sometimes permanently. And this is before there's disability. This is before there's the wreckage across Castle Gate was 1.5 miles wide. It's this incredibly devastating experience. And they actually have to get an injunction from a court to get the bodies out. Initially, they just want to seal up the mine and leave the bodies of the dead in there, which is offensive on a whole host of levels.
Yep.
But when you're talking about people who are Greek Orthodox or Japanese Shintos, or people where reverence for the body has these deep religious implications, it's just unacceptable, right? It's unacceptable to many of the not just the Greeks, but many of the cultures working the mine, that you would abandon the body. And it's this incredibly devastating experience. And I would say, in some ways, my grandparents were born after Castlegate exploded, but their generation, right? Like when you talk to their kind of generation of inner Mountain West Greeks,
yeah,
Castlegate is the experience that talks about why you don't want to be in the mine.
right.
And I believe that Ludlow, to some extent, but certainly by Castlegate, creates this resolve in the Greek communities in southern to get out of the mines. They are not going to be intergenerational mining families.
Right.
They're not going to get trapped down there.
It's something to be escaped, not something to perpetuate.
And you can't, I remember, one of the things I kind of heard again and again, especially is like, in the mid-90s, is talk about like what's going on in coal country in the East had started to pick up.
Right.
And what good job, these were good jobs that were going away.
Yeah.
I remember them saying
the union has to happen before those become good jobs.
And remember, the Greeks then leave the mine kind of before the unions.
Right.
I mean, not before, but before they're as powerful as they become. But I also think, no, I mean, I remember hearing, like no union check would make me go down in those mines.
Yeah.
And I would not do that. And I do think it's at the experience of like Castlegate. It's because it's not just a large number of men die in Castlegate. It is who the men are, right? The men who die there are not these are not sort of young men. It's a tragedy when young men die, but it's actually a social calamity when sort of breadwinners die, right? When the sort of men in their prime die that way. And so I think the Castlegate, Ludlow is, because it gets picked up by the labor movement, because it becomes this kind of national thing, I think people talk about that more, but I think the formative experience for Greeks in the Inner Mountain West then becomes Castlegate.
And then it's the massive loss of life of people who had people that depended on them, but it's also the very clear disregard for their lives in the face of investments, I guess is what I would call it. I would call a mule in that situation an investment.
Yeah.
It's a very blatant and clear message about what is valued and what is not.
And that if you get out then,
yeah,
you get out then, and you don't let your children go down into the mine.
Oh, absolutely.
I think there was definitely that if that's what it was going to be, you never let that happen to your children.
No, you find another way.
Whatever
that means.
And I think what Greeks are the second most educated ethnic group in America, third most educated ethnic group in America. Obviously, there is in a Greek American culture this value of education, but I mean, certainly with in the connection with the mines, this was, if they were going to send their kids to university, they were going to get them out of this situation if they had to, sell their right arm.
I also think too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's probably, I mean, as a whole community that experienced that at the same time, that's a community focus that shifts. That's not necessarily just individual families who experience this and then decide for their family. That's a whole community of people going, we no.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'd like to see more scholarship on this, but I really believe that Castlegate and mine experience, I might write something about this. I really believe that Castlegate mine experience changes how certainly the Greeks of the Intermountain West, you're right, it's this whole community goes, nope.
Yeah. Which is something I think we will expand upon, that community or not community element about it is something that we'll probably talk more about with my dad, because I don't think there is that same kind of community unifying organization in
No, and I think it was this, truly immediate and horrific experience at Castlegate. Even more than Ludlow, right? Because I mean, it's one thing if like you lose a battle. Greeks are used to losing wars.
Oh man.
But if you fight nobly, who cares? It's a different bag of beans.
A disaster with no real I don't mean to say no meaning, because clearly it had very far-reaching and reverberating consequences, but it's very different.
It's senseless.
Senseless, that's a better word. Yeah, it feels in many ways random and senseless. A massive loss of life that has no real reason necessarily.
Well, that's the thing, and I just thought about this, but the miners, I grew up on the stories of people escaping the Castlegate mine, and the miners who did get out, they got out not because the coal company came and helped them, right? Because they banded together in these family groups, right? Oftentimes these men were related to each other. They got together in these family groups and they got each other out.
Right.
And I don't think you shake that.
No, I would call that a formative experience, both as an individual or for a community. Either way. Yeah.
I don't think those are the kind of experience a community can't experience that. It's a small antidote. I grew up about 15 miles from Columbine High School, and I was an 8th grader at the time Columbine happened. And give away my age a little, I was about to go to high school. It was, spring, the semester before I went to high school. I competed in speech and debate against kids from Columbine, and when that happened, right, the community did not go back to normal. And this is a much larger, more diverse community.
Right.
But when that happened, everyone knew someone who was, and no one went back. It just couldn't go back to normal after that.
Right.
I just don't think that's the kind of experience people have that doesn't alter the entire community's mindset.
Well, I mean, I think that actually, I think that provides a lot of insight actually into that thing you talked about of that shift that doesn't necessarily happen, at least to the same extent in Appalachia. I'm sure there are families and things who have experiences like that, but it doesn't happen in the same kind of grand scale of we're not doing this anymore, which I'm sure we'll talk more about with my dad on the podcast. But there isn't that. But I think that adds context to that kind of attitude shift of we are not going to become generational miners after that. I get that. Do you have anything else that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think there's one last thing I want to talk about that I think helped keep that community cohesive.
Yeah.
And that's that if you're in southern Colorado, certainly if you're in eastern Utah, in the early part of the 20th century, there's only one other game in town, and that's the Mormons.
That's right. Yep.
And I'll keep this kind of brief, but I think that dynamic helped keep the Greek community of the Intermountain West pretty insular. So Helen Papanikolaou, who was a great historian of the Greeks of the Intermountain West and of Utah, who grew up.
We read one of her books in book club.
We read one of her books in book club.
About Greek mining communities.
She grew up there. But she wrote something that I love with all my heart, and I want to share it with you.
With me or the people or both?
People, with you, with the whole world.
Oh, wow. Great. Wow.
Because this encapsulates my own childhood, basically in a nutshell.
Got it.
Mormons, like us Greeks, were clannish, would not marry outsiders, and thought themselves an exceptional people with the only true religion on earth.
Huh. Yeah. I didn't know where you were going to go with wherever this was going, but like now that it's out there, it makes a lot of sense to me.
There's also a newspaper report from 1906. A journalist came from the East to sort of look at Mormons and look at Greeks, basically. And she comes back and she writes this newspaper story that says these people deserve each other.
Oh my God. That's right. Very strange, but also kind of funny.
Right. They mutually hate each other, and somehow they're just decide they want to live together. They're forced together by circumstances, but they stay apart.
Right.
The forces of assimilation in America are strong.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily bad. I mean, they're there, right? I think one of the things that kept this community so insular and kept it united in a way that did help them kind of lift themselves out of the mine was that the people who surrounded them were equally insular.
Right. So you could kind of, have your camp and their camp, and you're like near each other, but you're still very distinct. And
there's real boundaries that are established that people are not crossing. This is not being in Chicago where you're going to have an Italian neighbor and an Irish, there's Italians, there's Mexicans, there's Japanese working in the mines, but the clannishness of the Mormons sort of perpetuates this clannishness everywhere.
Right.
And I think that's one of the sort of key factors in that as well. So that's my little rant about that.
That's interesting.
I have an avocational interest in Mormon history, though, so if any point anybody wants to talk about that, comment.
Yeah. I mean, humans, I think if history teaches us anything, is that humans are very in-group, out-group, always. What defines the in-group versus the out-group is, of course, subject to change and fluctuation, but that kind of underpinning, I think, is a pretty consistent human
Absolutely.
thing, for better, I think, often for worse, often to our detriment. But, that's a whole other can of worms.
So yeah, no, that's my little spiel about that. I think there's more to talk about here, but I think that's an interesting part of our history.
Yeah, absolutely. And if folks at home, if you have interest in hearing us talk more about these parts of history, let us know in the comments. We will be doing a podcast episode about the kind of similarities and differences between communities in Appalachia versus the Intermountain West on our next podcast episode. Let me pull up my calendar. I should have done this before, which will be coming out on March 12th, barring something happening that complicates the issue. But the plan is for it to come out March 12th. If you're watching this video on the day of its release, you are watching it already on March 3rd. So it's not too terribly far away. It's next Friday. Our podcast releases every other Friday generally, and then we do videos every other Wednesday. That's kind of our content schedule in general. Sometimes things happen. It's not perfect. Sometimes we have off weeks, but that's in general the way our content comes out.
Cairo?
Yes, dear.
If the world were perfect, we would not long for heaven.
I hated how sincere you were when you said that. I hated how you looked at me so sincere with your cross on and said that about our content schedule. Well, anyway, I guess that's as good a place to end as anything else. You were so sincere looking at me just then. Saintly, one might say. But thank you for teaching me a little bit more about the history of the Intermountain West. I'm excited to have my dad come talk to us on the podcast about some other aspects of mining communities that were not as organized by ethnic identity, because I think that is one of the big differences between the Intermountain West
Yes.
and Appalachia. While, as you pointed out, a lot of it is Scotch-Irish, I don't think that is an organizing or unifying identity in the same way. I don't think it functions quite like that. So it'll be interesting.
No.
My dad knows much more about it than I do, though, so it would be interesting to talk to him about it. On our podcast, Katie, do you have anything else to say for the folks at home?
Cairo, I'm glad we don't work in a coal mine together.
I'm very glad we don't work in a coal mine together, and we have our cushy currently work from home jobs. Look at us, how far we've come, how different our lives are than those of both of our ancestors, actually. But thank you for coming to listen to us talk about coal mines. If you have other,
thank you.
If you have other things about this that we touched on that you want to hear more about, let us know in the comments. If there's something you have interest in hearing about that we've never talked about, also let us know in the comments. We're ultimately here for you guys, so let us know what you're interested in. If this was something you would like us to talk more about, we're more than happy to do so. But if you want to keep up to date on our content and what we're doing, go to our website, sign up for the newsletter, or the email letter is probably the best way to stay up to date, or follow us on social media. We're at the Hellenic Museum on all platforms. Let us know what you think.
Thank you. Bye-bye.